So let's get started. Anyway, so welcome everybody here in the room and online. I'm very pleased to see Tamara Gonzalez back with us, at least virtually. She has been a fellow here, longtime friend and colleague at the center. She graduated with a doctorate degree in law and a certificate in teaching, learning, and higher education from UVic, so not too long ago. She just told me her daughter still asks whether they can go back to Canada, which means Victoria. So you're always back, Tamara. So hopefully this will happen. But currently, she's a research associate at the Faculty of Law at the University of British Columbia, or I think more recent, a postdoctoral researcher at the Faculté de Droit de l'Université de Montréal. I'm not sure whether you're also a research assistant, but that's, I think, what I have at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute in Montreal, so at Concordia. So moving to the East over the past year. Before that, Tamara graduated from the University of Sao Paulo, from the law school and, the Catholic University as well in Sao Paulo. So what is important to know about Tamara, and also important for today's session, is that at the same time, while pursuing her scholarly career, Tamara has been very active in the feminist movement in Brazil for over 20 years, particularly through the national and international networks such as the Latin American and Caribbean Committee for the Defense of Women's Rights, and also the Global Campaign for Equality in Family Law. And we will hear a bit about this when Tamara will address the question of broadening women's rights through international advocacy. So we're very glad to see you back, Tamara. Such an important issue, in particular in a time in which there's lots of political contestation and also doubt in the whole issue of equality, women's rights. So all the more your work is so important. Welcome back, Tamara, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Oliver. Thank you, everyone. I'm very happy to be part again at the center. I think I never left. I say that I am the fellow that came in and never left. Really with my community. So I'm super happy to be here today. So thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit of my work that I have been doing or I just kept doing, I think, on women's rights. I think I'm just going to ask permission to share my screen just a minute here. Up here. So my daughter asks me if we can come back to Canada because I don't know, I think because here people speak French. So she thinks that Victoria is Canada, but here is not Canada. So for some reason, that happens. So, oops, I'm just at the end of it. Okay, wait. Okay, so here we go. So thank you for the audience today, and let's get into it. So I would like to respectfully acknowledge that I join you today from Yaya, Montreal, the unceded lands of the Kanaka Nation. But I also am very thankful for my journey at UVic. So I also acknowledge and respect the Lakwagan, Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the University of UVic stands, and the Locanic and Westanic people on whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I feel like I'm extremely grateful for all the learning that I had while at UVic, either through the land and through the community that I found there, particularly at the Center for Global Studies. So thank you. So for today, I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to bring an overview of parental alienation and parental alienation syndrome and related concepts. I've talked with Jody a little bit about that, and it seems a hard concept. So I'm just going to give an overview of that, show a little bit how is this playing out in Canada and Latin America and Caribbean. Of course, it's going to be a snapshot because, Latin America and Caribbean and Canada are just very broad and too big. And then I'm going to share a little bit of feminist initiatives to discuss this parental alienation and related concepts as a new form of gender-based violence through international activism. So, starting here today, yes. So I truly believe in serving our communities through feminist community engaged scholarship. So if it's true that academic inquiry, we are free to pursue any kind of questions through academic inquiry, why not base our research, base our investigations in the needs of our communities so that we can put our knowledge, the things that we learn at university to work to build a better place, right? So I truly believe in that. And that's why I say that, my primary interests are gender and law, human rights and law, through feminist social legal research. But I also have these two big dreams that I try to bring it to my everyday practice. As a scholar or a professor once told me, feminism is not something that you learn only on the books, but it's something that you practice every day. So it's something that we do, not only that we think with our heads. And in this context, I have these big dreams or this big drive, which is to connect the global south and the global north, or the local with the global, always in conversation, because I think that we can learn so much from others' experiences. So just to think about it, for example, everything that is happening in the US right now, or the extreme right growing everywhere, and threatens to democratic states. In Latin America, for example, we have been dealing with this for a while. We had many dictatorships. We have some experience on that. So, let's share and see how can we build up solutions together, and learn from each other. So I truly, by being a Brazilian sort of lost in Canada, or found in Canada, I try to make these connections between the two axes, as to say. And I also think it's very important to try to bridge academic inquiry or academic research knowledge, and social needs through law or law-related activism. So how can we use law to strengthen democracy, to promote women's rights, to advance on gender equality, right? So how can we use our legal knowledge to make more research to support feminist activism and etc. So this is where I come from and sort of where I am to, what I want to do, and what I have been doing over my 20 years. And so this work that I'm going to present today, it's pretty much a reflection or an example of this kind of activism or community engaged research, where I build in or from the concrete or lived experiences of women and try to bring them, make them visible at the international community, and call for protections, call attention from human rights bodies, and etc. So to start, because I'm going to use the example of parental alienation or parental alienation syndrome, I'm just going to give an overview of that. So parental alienation or parental alienation syndrome was a term first coined by Richard Gardner, who was a doctor, and he defined, or he created this concept in a text that he published in 1985, where he defined it as a childhood disorder that arises almost exclusively in the context of child custody disputes. It results from the combination of a programming, brainwashing, parents' indoctrinations, and the child's own contributions to the vilification of the target parent. So basically what he says is that in the context of disputed or controversial divorce, one parent may try to vilify the other parent and cause estrangement between the parent and the child. And even though his theory seems to be somehow gender neutral, it became clear over time that it's an extremely sexist, misogynist concept, because over the mother is the one who is accused, or the one who is identified with the one who's alienating the child. she is manipulative or she seeks revenge from her ex-partner. And he's also a controversial person in the sense that he is pointed out as a person who defended pedophilia. And even though he has more than 40 books published, they were mostly self-published. His theory was never backed up by clinical studies or published in peer-reviewed journals. So he's very controversial. Further review, so we're saying he started claiming this theory in the 80s, but after that, this was reviewed for many or different authors that try to sort of move away from this parental alienation syndrome and just reframe it with different names or parental alienation or other similar terms. But the key concepts remain. So we see that over time, this is more and more framed as a form of one parent trying to denigrate or the other parent, and the child who is subjected to such alienation be presenting a lot of signals or signs of really being sided with one parent, the supposed alienating parent, with a lack of ambivalence. They don't have any guilt. They seem to show borrowed scenarios. So according to Gardner and people who reframe his theory after that, these would be signs of alienation. The problem is that, in fact, a child can show these symptoms in cases where she was exposed or subjected to sexual abuse or other forms of domestic violence or abuse in emotional, physical abuse. So not wanting to engage with one of the parents might actually signal violence. And this would be a natural expression of healthy actually behavior from a child who has experienced violence. But it has been interpreted more and more as a sign of alienation. And also together with this, we see the emergence of the theory of false memories. So the idea that women could create false memories of sexual abuse to cause harm to their ex-partners. But this is also a very complicated theory in the sense that if you know a little bit about child development, children, especially at a young age, cannot create or reproduce a coherent story of violence and abuse and sustain it, right? So a child may use terms that are not appropriated, displaced, but they will not be able to recall and explain exactly what happened in a situation of sexual abuse if she has not lived. Because children in the first years of life, they learn through experiences, so they can only reproduce and talk about it, the things they have experienced. So when we talk about false memories, we are not only disqualifying women's claims or the fact that women are reporting violence, but also we are disqualifying children's own voices and reports of the violence they have experienced. Despite all that, we've been seeing parental alienation and related concepts being introduced in family law, custody disputes all over the world. And we have here more from an interdisciplinary perspective, we have many medical and psychological associations and human rights bodies saying that parental alienation is not a recognized disease. So the American Psychiatric Association does not recognize it as a mental disease. European Association of Psychotherapy, the Spanish Association of Neuropsychiatry, and others. Even the World Health Organization, the CSW is the Commission on the Status of Women that recognized it in 2022 as a problematic concept. GRAVIO is the body that monitors the Istanbul Convention, which is the convention that fights violence against women, mostly in the European context. They all reject PAS. And feminist studies over time have been accumulating more evidence that when the idea of parental alienation is invoked in a case of divorce, it's usually used by the male ex-partner, and it's used as a weapon or a way to silence the mothers and pathologize mothers. And I'm going to bring some data on that. Investigations has also been finding that when we have the allegation of parental alienation, we are actually allowing a continued, we're allowing the exercise of continued control over the other parent, impoverishment of a parent who was accused of PAS. So we have judicial procedures that keep going on forever and ever. And if you think about in a case of divorce in a family where there was domestic abuse, often this woman already leaves the relationship impoverished in a difficult financial situation. To keep going with legal fees for so long can really cause troubles in her financial autonomy. What tends to happen when parental alienation is invoked in these divorce cases is that the custody is switched to the other parent or to the alienated parent. So that means that when a mother says that there has been sexual violence or other forms of violence, the judge, to cure of alienation, changes the custody from the mother and gives it to the father. The problem with that is that this decision is being made based on a concept that is highly controversial, not recognized for medical associations, and we are actually putting the children in the care of potential abusers. So it's a risk. It also sometimes causes drastic consequences for the children's lives. And here's when we see the continuing effect of Gardner's theory, because Gardner, he used to say that to cure parental alienation, we had to work with removing completely the alienating parent from the scenario. So cutting all contact with this alienating person. And that was also known as theory of threat. Like, it was a threatening theory. It was a way to say, okay, if we don't allow this child to be in the care of the father or in contact with the father, we're going to remove custody completely. So also what we have seen, and more research in different fields have been showing, is that through this continued process that keeps going on for many years, usually when this happens or these allegations are invoked, also takes a toll on the mental health of mothers and children who are subjected to judicial procedures over and over and over and over. And this can be compounded in cases where we see, for example, for migrant women, Black women, Indigenous women, any women that somehow have any form of maternity or motherhood that does not conform with what would be whatever ideal of motherhood that we have. So from the years 2000 onwards, we have seen this concept being invoked in many, many countries. Usually once domestic abuse or child abuse is claimed by the mother, and the mother is often advised to not raise domestic abuse in divorce or custody cases. This is also a very interesting thing, because also what we have been seeing on feminist research is that even though there are laws to protect women against domestic abuse, judges who work on family law tend to not understand the depth and the breadth of domestic abuse. So concentrate much more on physical violence. And now what we have been seeing more is emotional abuse, financial abuse, coercive control, which are different forms of violence, very severe as well, but are often dismissed by the courts, and particularly family courts. And here, because I'm a lawyer, I see a very interesting disconnection or connection, because usually cases of domestic abuse or violence, they run through a criminal court, while family abuse or family disputes like divorce and custody and guardianship go through family law. So we have family law in the private law and criminal law in the public law. But in reality, we need to have a more holistic vision or integration of these two fields, because then we have two separate proceedings that are highly costly and are not effective, because the findings not always communicate well between one area and the other. And that's it. The judges and family courts don't understand a lot of domestic violence, and focus way more in physical violence. So this puts a barrier on recognizing when women are suffering other forms of violence, and pursuing the criminal procedures are also very heavy or difficult on top of the already complicated family disputes. So we've been seeing this problem related to parental alienation, and this was something new for me as well. In Brazil, Canada, Colombia, Croatia, Greece, Iceland, Ireland, England and Wales, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, Israel, Italy, New Zealand, USA. So many places to explore this topic. I'm just going to focus on Canada and some places in LAC, as I said. So in Canada, we have some literature on parental alienation in family courts, but not so many literature, or not so much deep or quality big reviews on from a feminist perspective. What we see is that, and this is the interesting thing also that I found, when we look from literature from different places around the world, we see that in the 80s and the 90s, we had some cases of parental alienation, but from the 2000 onwards, we have an escalation of these cases. So everywhere that we see this mirror tendency where we have the cases growing. So according to this study, for example, in 68% of the cases in Canada, from 1999 to 2008, we had the majority of women being considered the alienated parent, so the one who was practicing parental alienation. A recent research from Professor Simon de Lapierre at the University of Ottawa has also been doing extensive and in-depth interviews with women that were accused of practicing parental alienation. And the majority of them had experienced some sort of domestic abuse, and 50% of their children were also physically abused, and 25% sexually abused. And when these abuse was claimed before the courts, that's when fathers invoked parental alienation. Another research in Quebec that's from 2018, and this one I find really interesting. Well, first of all, it mirrors the general data where the majority of mothers are being found to be the alienating parents, so 68%. In many cases, the women are forced to take therapy, so they have mandatory therapy that they have to follow along with their children. We end up having courts micromanaging family relations. And then in some cases, for example, we see in cases like this one, Droit des Familles 1167, this first one. In the case of, we have a history of domestic abuse and alcoholism. When the mother brings in that information to the court, this is considered as the mother trying to make a bad portrait of the father just to estrange the father from the children. This other case, the mother received, this was here in Quebec. So the mother received a job offer in another city, and she wanted to move. And because she asked permission to move, this was considered a form of alienation, parental alienation. So, she just wanted to have a better salary and have a different life. And so she was trapped in a way in this location, right? But then Zakur, she makes a question in this paper particularly that I think it's very smart and very interesting. She says, what level of friendliness toward an ex-abusive husband must women demonstrate to avoid raising suspicions of parental alienation? Because really, if you suffer domestic abuse, how can you be encouraging your child to leave or spend time alone with a violent ex-partner? If you have experienced controlling behaviors or sexual abuse, or you've seen your child living through sexual abuse, how can you be encouraging that this child will be spend time alone with this parent? But another thing that she shows in this research is that both things happen. So fathers are often excused for any dubious behaviors, but mothers are heavily judged on any behaviors that are not considered normal or standard for motherhood. So, for example, sleeping with the child was considered an alienating behavior, or being too present, too friendly with the child. These were examples of the mother being overprotective and anxious, and this would sign that there was something wrong with this mother. She was a resentful mother and wanted to ruin that father's lives. So when we're looking in Brazil, for example, where we have a law on parental alienation that was passed in 2010, we also see this same tendency where a lot of cases or where we have domestic violence, the father invokes parental alienation. When there was cases of abuse, when the mother claims sexual abuse, the father also claims parental alienation in the majority of the cases, and the mother is found as the alienator parent in 70% of the cases. So this is a little bit similar. I don't think it's here, but in this research from Severi too, she also shows that in the majority, here, no expert. So overall, there was not really expert evidence that was showed or discussed in courts, but when some expert vision was requested, they were usually applied to the mother. So if a mother claims, oh, this is a abusive person, he has abusive behaviors, sexual abuse the child, or etc., instead of having an assessment for the mental health of the abuser or potential abuser, the mother was subjected of this medical examination in 82% of the cases. So here we see how the word of the woman is not really believed by the courts when they say they are suffering domestic abuse. We also have laws or rules about it in Puerto Rico, in Mexico, that has laws. Mexico has different laws in different provinces. Argentina doesn't have a specific law, but we have seen this concept kind of infiltrating family court decisions, a little bit like in Canada too, because we don't have a law on parental alienation in Canada, but it has been decided through the courts and becoming case law and etc. Uruguay recently passed a law as shared custody that was considered as a way to include parental alienation as sort of disguised. And in 2023, I went to Brazil to coordinate an event that we were discussing parental alienation in the region, which is now resulting in a book that we're going to launch this year on the topic. And I heard from a mother, these two different mothers, these two sentences, and they just broke my heart. So one of them said, I would rather die than seek the justice system again. And the other one said, I know my children are dead inside, but at least they are with me. So many mothers lost their children, so I consider myself lucky. This was a mother of two twin girls that were sexually abused at the age of 3, I think. So she was able to maintain custody and guardianship of their kids, but the children were forced to see the parent because she was accused of parental alienation. Anyway, so it's a problem that it's spreading all over. In Colombia in 2023, we had the decision from the Supreme Court that forbids the use of any diagnosis based on or related to parental alienation, considering that it's not validated by science, harms children's rights, reproduces gender stereotypes, and creates discrimination, resulting in gender-based violence against women. So I think this is really the core of the issue. When parental alienation is invoked, what we see is all the gender stereotypes emerging in judicial decisions in favor of the parent, the male parent, the father, and in detriment of the mother, right? So often this mother, she's discredited, she's non-believed, and she experiences what we call institutional violence, which is a form of human rights violation in itself. So with all this, women started to get organized, and start working. So this is just a reminder on, if we think about international human rights law as a space for activism, as a space to build consensus, as a space to create a new language and thinking about the power of feminism in naming things. So naming parental alienation as institutional violence, as a new form of gender-based violence, or creating a common set of demands. So we've been doing, like feminists have been doing this for so long. So in 1975, International Women's Years, and the International Conference in Mexico, Vienna Declaration, and so many other international commitments that this year turned, or last year, or this year turned 30. And even like the CEDAW Convention, which is the one I'm going to talk more today, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which was adopted in 1979. So through activism and through transnational activism, women were able to put forward a public agenda to take domestic violence from a private issue to become a public matter, to become a human rights issue, right? So that was a big change. That's what we see happening here with parental alienation. So just a quick overview on the CEDAW Convention and the CEDAW Committee. It was approved in 1979 by the UN General Assembly, came into force in 1981, has 189 parties and 99 signatories. Signatories are countries that have signaled that they want to be part of the convention, but have not really ratified the convention. The convention has 16 substantive articles, which are articles that establish rights, and 14 procedural rules, including guidelines of how the committee should work. So the committee oversees the implementation of the convention, and I'm going to show a little bit how the committee can do that. So if you think really as the CEDAW Convention and this space that we have created as a space for exchange, a space for fighting, a space for creating new concepts and broadening what is in the convention, we can see there are a lot of actions that we can do. So the convention itself, it's quite conservative if we read it with our eyes of today, 2025. So for example, the convention doesn't even frame domestic abuse or gender-based violence. It only talks about discrimination. With the work with the committee over the years, the committee established that gender-based violence and domestic abuse are acute forms of discrimination. So they were able to broaden the rights established at the convention through interpretation in general recommendations, but also through the work of the constructive dialogue they do with the states. So I'm going to show how we have been doing this with the CEDAW Committee in the case of parental alienation. So usually when a state ratifies an international treaty, the state is saying that they are assuming a commitment not only to enforce those rights at the national level, but it's an international community commitment. It's a commitment with the international community that they are going to be enforcing those rights. So how do we know that a state who had ratified a convention is actually implementing the rights? So we have the periodic review. So it used to be every 4 years. Now it was recently updated to 8 years. So each 8 years, the committee, the states should submit reports. So, for example, Canada has ratified the CEDAW Convention. So every 8 years, Canada has to send a report to the members of the committee saying, here's what we've been doing to respect women's rights according to Article 1, we've been doing this, Article 2, we've been doing that, etc., etc., etc. What happens is that sometimes states not always show all the information in these reports, and that's when nonprofit organizations come into play with shadow reports, where they bring in additional information that might not be contemplated in the official reports. So they can bring in here, on this first arrow here, shadow reports. In the moment where the country is being prepared to be reviewed, that's when we come in and present these shadow reports. Then we can do briefing meetings with committee experts if we are able to attend the session in person. And once we have the concluding observations, because the committee members, they receive all the information, they meet with the state party, they meet with the nonprofit organizations, and they question the state in all the issues that were presented as problematic. And after they present concluding observations, as to say, they say, well, you need more information on domestic violence. The efforts in promoting participation of women in politics are not enough. We could do better. Maybe we could try some quota laws and these and that. So that's why we call it a constructive dialogue, because the committee starts to help or support the state in better implementing the convention. And that's also here where nonprofit organizations have a crucial role in disseminating and monitoring the implementation. So once we have a concluding observation, we can use it in internal litigation, in fighting for local, national advocacy, in so many other actions, right? So these shadow reports, they could be just going a little bit deeper so I can bring the example of parental alienation. The reports can be thematic or review the whole convention. So they are reviewing the whole convention when they go article by article, giving information of what's happening. But when they are thematic, the organization, they choose one specific topic and they go very deep on that. They offer counter information. They can suggest questions to be asked to the state party being reviewed. And they can also suggest recommendations on the implementation of the convention. The organizations can try to have briefing meetings. So every time that we have a hearing at the CEDAW Committee, nonprofit organizations have at least 1 hour with the committee members without the state. So it's a space where organizations can talk freely, even presenting information against the state. So it's a safety issue. They can prepare fact sheet materials, and they can follow up on the public sessions and book. Sometimes, depending on the context, if we have like civil war or other conflictual times, we can also request like safe private meetings with the members of the committee. The UN also allows for these sort of procedures. The reports can also be submitted through coalitions, and they can help us in advocacy and fighting for rights on the ground. Because even though the UN system is this like big, far away system, when you come to your local, policy or a state member and you're just saying, well, but the UN recommended that we repeal this law. This has a weight, even though, the law, international human rights law, doesn't have a police enforcement kind of. It has this weight so far. World is changing fast. So the topic of like domestic abuse and how we've been discussing custody. First, we have been building up, feminists have been building up this subject before the CEDAW Committee. So the CEDAW Committee, apart from receiving or doing the follow-up periodic review, they can also receive individual cases. So in 2014, they decided on this case called González Carreño versus Spain. And it was a case, I'm not going to go too deep in the story, but it was a woman who suffered domestic abuse, got a divorce, and she asked for her child to not have unsupervised visits with her ex-partner, which was denied many, many times. And over the time, she called protection services for children over 40 times, and she was never heard. And eventually, in one of those visits, her daughter was killed by her ex-partner. So this case was presented to the committee, who then decided that the state was responsible for not properly and taking all the measures to prevent that from happening. And that set an interesting precedent to consider that prior acts of domestic violence need to be taken in consideration when we are discussing child custody and visiting rights, supervision or not supervision of this visit. So this was one first in 2014. More recently, we have, because the problem, as I said, have been escalating from the 2000 onwards, many organizations have been bringing this topic to the CEDAW Committee and other bodies, international human rights bodies. So I'm going to talk more about what CEDAW has been doing, which is this committee that works for women's rights in the LAC region. What we have been doing in bringing this in partnership in so many cases with the Global Campaign for Equality in the Family Laws. So in 2023, we had a briefing launch on the importance of discussing family law, because when they have the CEDAW committees have the sessions with the state, they go article by article. Article 16 is the last substantial article, is the last article that has established a right, is the right of equality in family. And it often gets very little attention from the committee. So we started building up the necessity of like taking more time to discuss family in within the CEDAW, and then arguing that if we don't have equality in the family, we don't have equality in society more broadly. Inequality inside the family leaks into inequality in the society more broadly, because when we don't have a fair division of care work, for example, women cannot participate in the public sphere as much. When we have domestic abuse, etc., etc., etc. We started by doing advocacy work on shadow reports, bringing specifically the topic of parental alienation for Uruguay, Brazil, and Canada. And then feminists also have pushed for the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, which is another mechanism from the UN, to talk about custody and family law. And this is Special Rapporteur, she actually put out a report where she's clearly articulated that parental alienation is used in family law proceedings by abusers as a tool to continue their abuse and coercion, and to undermine and discredit allegations of domestic violence made by mothers who are trying to keep the children safe. In 2023, we brought a shadow report from Uruguay, where they were discussing this shared custody, and we had a positive response from the committee where they said we need to monitor this mechanism to ensure that shared custody does not, reinforce gender-based violence. Then in 2024, we did a specific report on early marriages, because in Brazil, the age of 18 can be flexibilized to allow marriage under the age of the 18, and parental alienation. And then because Canada was also reviewed last year, and I was talking, with activists from the Global Campaign and Gambi, which is the organization that supports Brazilian women moving abroad. I was just thinking, parental alienation is a problem in Canada. We should put in a report. Oh, but we don't have that. No, we have to put in a report. Let's put in a report. And then we did, and then we were very successful. So in the committee, in the Brazilian report, the committee clearly articulated our concerns, and recommended the state party to repeal the parental alienation law, and to eliminate judicial gender bias to ensure that domestic courts give due weight considerations in cases of domestic violence, to protect the best interests of the child, and deciding on visit and custody, etc. We are also very successful in the case of Canada, and here I would like to highlight, because Canada has received a lot of shadow reports, but ours was the only one that brought in the topic of parental alienation. And this was the first time that the topic was brought to the committee by civil society in Canada. And it was very successful because the committee manifested its concern about the lack of studies on the impact of federal family law reforms. This was highlighted in our shadow report, because we had some family law changes in 2021, but this was not really, there was an important change, but in the end, it didn't really solve the problem of family law, which is in Canada, which is also linked with the lack of funding for women to access justice in cases of divorce. We have way more funding for free access to justice, or supported by legal aid in cases of criminal law. And here comes in again that tension between public and private law. So we have way more funding to support people who are dealing with problems with criminal law than we have funding to support family law cases. And the lack of mandatory training on domestic violence and intersectionality for family court judges and other professionals within the family court system. So the committee recommended that the state party take studies, generate data, so that we better understand how family law has been impacted by these new laws. The changes on family law have been impacting decisions where we have domestic violence, and data on parental alienation or legal or similar concepts. This is very important because, as I said, with all the controversial around Gardner, many people have been moving away from parental alienation, but using similar terms, and ensure that family court judges and other professionals in the family court system are trained on domestic violence and intersectionality. So this was also highlighted. So we were very happy when these recommendations came out. The VESACV, which is also, it's the mechanism that oversees the Belém do Pará Convention, which is the Inter-American Convention to protect women against gender-based violence, also issued recommendations on this matter, saying that we need to consider domestic violence against women when defining custody and visiting rights, ensure access to justice to all victims of gender-based violence, and etc. GRAVIO, which I have already mentioned, it's a mechanism that oversees the Istanbul Convention, which is the Convention on Violence Against Women in the European system. Recently, now in November 2024, also recommended that the Swedish government look more carefully into the issue of parental alienation. But what I like to, when I bring in all these new decisions or recommendations, what I find really fascinating is that none of these would have been possible if they were not provoked by nonprofit organizations or activists who were bringing the issue to these committees. So also the power of, in a world where we feel so maybe sometimes disencouraged, to see how the constant fight or to name something as a violence have been repercuting or giving resulting in good declarations or framing it in a better way to support our fights at the local level. So I find it also fascinating how so many different countries, from Colombia to Puerto Rico to Brazil to Canada and Sweden, might have the same issue. And I don't think it's by chance. Of course not. We see a very articulated action from very conservative groups that push parental alienation in many jurisdictions, often supported by fathers groups aligned sometimes with extreme right, far right groups. So the problem is bigger than just parental alienation is a part of this broader activism to take women out of the public sphere, as to say. And so this is the book that we'll be launching this year. It's called, in Portuguese, Alienação Parental, uma nova forma de violência de gênero contra mulheres e crianças na América Latina e Caribe. So parental alienation, a new form of gender-based violence against women and children in Latin America and Caribbean, which I have been working on and has article. It's an interdisciplinary book that we have doctors, psychologists, lawyers, and even mothers who were accused of parental alienation, describing the situation in 5 countries in the region. And the good news is that we are working on the translation of the whole book into Spanish and English. So we'll probably have first the Portuguese version out in early April, and followed by the English and the Spanish version of it, to share a little bit what the fight has been on the ground in these countries. And that's it. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm available if you have any further questions.
Thank you, Tamara, for introducing us to your important project and the intricacies of doing advocacy work for women's rights in an international arena. Who would like to start us off with questions? Also online, if you would like to either let me know that you want to come in or put your question into the chat box, I suppose are options for you to engage.
Oh,
Yeah,
hi, my name's Caitlin Jansen. We haven't met, but I'm I don't know where to look. I'm the
always the owl.
Okay. I'm the program manager for the Borders and Globalization Lab with Emmanuel Bonet-Joly. But actually, your research really reminded me, and it really is similar to a project I worked on way back in, I think, 2010, where we had a international conference and a book about similar laws, but specifically in child welfare, called Failure to Protect. I don't know if you're familiar. Simone LaPierre was also on that project, but it was a similar thing in child welfare law, where it was supposed to be gender neutral languaging, but what it ended up being was a way for child welfare to take children away from mothers who failed to protect, and the syndrome under was around like child witnessing violence. So if the mother was being abused, they were penalized for failing to protect the child from seeing them being abused. And this was a really common practice around that, and ended up, we have a book about it too, but anyway, really similar. But I think one thing I was wondering about is the role of child lawyers in this. So I know in Ontario, they have the office like of appointed child lawyers in cases, so the child has its own legal representation, and in First Nation law too. So have you followed that at all, or is that one of the recommendations, or is it a common practice anywhere outside of Ontario?
Should I answer or wait?
No, you go ahead, Tamara.
Go ahead. Okay. Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, sometimes, I know the project Borders and Globalization, and because this is a transborder issue, it can have a complicated transborder issue with the Hague Convention and parental alienation. That's another, I keep thinking, oh gosh, I need to write an article and send to them. I need to write an article on that and send to them, because the Hague Convention is about international subtraction of children, but in many cases, women are really running away from domestic violence. So I would say two things that, like, yeah, I mean, this is not a new practice. This is not a new thing. And really, the parental alienation thing, what it does, it's really placing women in an impossible situation as the one you just mentioned, because if they report the violence, they are accused of parental alienation. If they don't report the violence, they are accused of neglect towards the children. So they are in this really impossible situation where they never win in courts, right? So then comes in the case of the lawyers for the children. Here in Quebec, we have that as well. And in other places around the world, some people have been discussing, I think it was in Argentina, where they were also trying to bring that in. You know, I haven't read too much extensively on that, but what I've seen is that they're really not super helpful, because if we're looking at the judicial system and the people who operate within it as, you know, having this patriarchal sexist vision, to have a lawyer that protects the children that shares that same vision won't help much. So unless we were really sure that this specific lawyer was a person who was really trained to listen to the children, to, you know, be aware of this, you know, this false syndrome or this non-existent syndrome, as we like to say, and etc., it could actually worsen things, because then they just can reinforce these arguments of alienation. For example, you know, if a child refuses to see the father, for example, but the lawyer of the children has a very strong vision or believes in parental alienation and all that, he would just keep forcing the child to visit with the father, even if the child doesn't want to. So I think ideally it's a beautiful idea and could work, but I think whatever, if we do that, we need to make sure that these people have more training and more gender sensitive training, because in reality, so law is not neutral, but how do we make sure that when it's implemented, we are having this sort of gender sensitive filter that will allow it to be a more just decision outcome, you know? And I think that unfortunately, or maybe this was maybe a second wave feminist, second wave sort of bet that we did in a lot of, we're going to change the law, and changing the law, we're going to, you know, make it, and we're going to achieve equality and this and that. But in the end, if we just move forward changing the law, but we don't change the social cultural context, the law keeps being applied through this biased gender stereotypes. And that's where we are in now. And I find really unfair that after all that we have fought for women to have protection and children to have protection under the law, we're using the law to penalize women for speaking out about their violence. So how do we get them trapped? I think not necessarily, because sometimes people say, okay, if we banish the law of parental alienation, we won't solve the problem, because the courts will keep with this vision. So we need to work on gender sensitive training. So yeah, having this lawyer could be good, but only if they have this mandatory gender sensitive sort of training, you know. I think that would be my take on it.
Thank you, Tamara. This leads straight into the question that we have online by Mylene Ellerman. Let me read this to you. Can you talk more about any best practice for educating court actors and increasing judicial accountability for biased decisions? The problem in the US is that members of the reunification industry train judges, custodial evaluators, girls, and parenting coordinators. So the belief in PA runs deep. It is a major challenge in mainstreaming the coercive control model, even in states where we have legislation. I'm looking for ideas to create change at the local level, state level. I'm going to be studying the implementation of the new CC law in MA, my MA, but we need more strategies for reform. So I think, Tamara, that's where you started, you know, reflect what you started reflecting on. So maybe you can take this question.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that we have a big problem because I say sometimes that it would be easier to train gods than judges. You know, judges, it's really hard to have judges accepting that they need to follow training because they're, I mean, I'm a lawyer, so I can be hard on my own category kind of thing because this is a real challenge, often after going through so many years of learning and training and this and that, when you become a judge, you just feel like, okay, I want to decide on things and I don't need training, etc. um Also, I think there is another I'm not sure I'm going to give a solution here. I think I'm adding challenges to the challenge that you brought. I think the other challenge is that at least in many parts of the world, in Brazil and other countries in Latin America, that's for sure, maybe in the US as well, people in the judiciary are very conservative. They tend to be like super conservative people. So it's really hard to, broaden a little bit, which makes me think because one day I thought, I'm going to be a judge. And then I was like, and I'm going to, change the system from the inside. But then I was like, okay, no, maybe I need to operate outside of the system. So people who are maybe a little bit not so traditional, they step out of the system because they can't breathe in those systems. But anyways, personal digression. I think that what we need to do is really push for this sort of mandatory trainings because in the end, so I don't know, some sort of mechanism that from time to time they have to do refreshing course or something like that. It's challenging. In Brazil, for example, we passed a protocol that demands judges to be trained on gender issues and do sort of gender sensitive rulings. But it was passed a while ago, and the amount of judges who actually undergo the training is very little. So we need to create accountability, not only rules but accountability mechanisms. Maybe something, you will only progress in your career if you have X hours of training and this, and human rights and this and this and that. That could be an idea. But of course, each reality is different and each country, the judicial system operates slightly different, like civil law, common law, and etc. I think there are so many ideas and so many interesting courses that we could offer. The really tricky thing is how to bring judges on board with this. And I just wanted to comment on this, the reunification camps. This is a big problem in the United States, which is for those who doesn't know, it's basically they created sort of camps where children are sent to rebuild their relationship to the fathers. So, but they are forced to do so through very questionable methods. The lightest what I could say, maybe not so compromising, what I could say is like, questionable methods. They are forced to interact with their fathers. And there has been evidence of camps in Canada or even Canadian children being sent to camps in the United States. I think that a big issue too is because people who offer these camps or run these camps or believe and push forward discussions in parental alienation, they tend to have quite a bit of money to run these workshops and and all that, which unfortunately often it's not the case with feminist organizations, especially grassroots organizations. So it becomes a really uneven battle in a way because the resources to reach out and offer different views on the local realities are limited, especially for, for example, feminist organizations versus other organizations that might have more financial conditions to do so. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but if you send me an email, maybe we could, start thinking about ideas together and ways we could cooperate transnationally and, sharing ideas. Thank you.
Good luck with your MA, Marlene. It's now over to Fazila, who I'm sure you've met during your time here at the center.
Hello, Tamara. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. My question relates a little bit to the transnational feminist networks that you mentioned that were conducive to the approval of the CEDAW and creating this broader umbrella under which each country could follow regulate their own context. So I was wondering, these transnational networks work. How does it relate to the different social, political, and legal systems in each country? So is their role, does their role end at the creation of this umbrella level, or their function and their work has a way of, in a way, affecting the local context as well, or an interaction with the local feminist movements? Does it continue in any way? And as a second question, if there is time, I was wondering if you notice any major challenges or opportunities or different ways of operating depending on the regime type that you find in different contexts. So if there is a semi-authoritarian context or a democratic context, how does this play out in the work of your networks? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I think for the first question, absolutely, it's always a two-way road, let's just say, because the idea is precisely that we can amplify whatever is happening at the national level when we bring something internationally. So usually when we bring something at the international level, it's because our efforts to be heard at the national level aren't working. So we are saying, this is not working. This, we need protection. Kids are dying, mothers are dying. This is a chaotic situation. We need help. So we raise to the issue to the international level. And I think and usually when we bring these things to these spaces, it's really connected with grassroots and sort of, local movements. Just to give you one example, because so this year when we had the Brazilian review of the CEDAW, we had, I think, 41 shadow reports, some presented in coalitions, some individually, but adding up to, I think, more than 90 organizations represented on them. So not everyone can get there, but even like when we got there, I was lucky because I was able to be there. And it was challenging because in the opening session, for example, for the civil society, we had 10 minutes and like 50 people to speak, because we all were there and trying to have a time. So it takes a lot of political work also to coordinate, to make alliances, to make sure that we cover everything in those 10 minutes, to bring the relevant issues. In the case of Brazil, especially the issue of diversity and representation. So, making sure we have Black women, Indigenous women also there speaking for their issues. We had a trans woman too, who shared the talk with us, this opening speech. But they truly represent, grassroots movement. So for example, this trans woman, she actually comes from a grassroots movement from trans women in a favela in Rio de Janeiro. And then, and it was actually an interesting thing for Brazil because Portuguese is not an official language of the UN, but we were provided translators because a lot of the activists could not speak English. So we had to find a way to make it work, and to make it accessible what they were saying, right? Especially because it's the UN. So yes, I think it's a two-way, one feed into another. We bring to the global sphere whatever is happening on the ground. And when we achieve something like a concluding observation that helps us. We use it on our grassroots work. We use it in, for example, in our submissions to judges in strategic national litigation. We use to press for change laws or policies at the local level, and so on. So this is precisely the idea. This is the movement that we want to see and that we want to happen. But it's also tricky. Of course, there are funding issues and so many other issues, diversity within feminism and different threads, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But yes, I think building coalitions and try to work together often works best. In the question of democratic and undemocratic times, that's a very good question because we're facing not an easy scenario ahead, right? The new Trump administration being like pulling off most of international human rights bodies and associations and etc. And everything else. So this brings a lot of questions about this. The United Nations was formed in the belief of multilateralism and international cooperation. So this is, the key issues. Usually when we have a non-democratic regime, we have this focus on nationalism and etc., and a tendency to withdraw from these spaces. Sorry, I just saw something on the chat right now. Let me go back to my thinking. So when we have this nationalist or extreme right, etc., non-democratic regimes, they tend to sort of pull out, or in many cases pull out from these democratic international multilateral spaces, in many, many ways, officially as Trump is doing right now. But for example, when we had Bolsonaro in Brazil, we had scheduled, like, it was on time for Brazil to be reviewed by the CEDAW Committee, for example. And Bolsonaro decided, no, we're not sending information, we're not participating. So the review didn't happen because, the country was not there to be reviewed. And then, so we had a gap of many, many years because of that, and of course, that makes it harder for the organizations, that makes it more difficult for us to use whatever emerges from the global arena within our local fights. Because if you have a government that doesn't care on how they look internationally, or doesn't care about this multilateral cooperation, international cooperation, it won't have this such effect, because the United system is basically built up on this idea of international pressure, and how can we ameliorate things or make things better through this. And so political will plays a big role, but also, so that can be a green scenario in a way. But I was actually discussing with a friend of mine from Pakistan yesterday, and I was telling her, what we do. And then she said, well, at the same time, when nothing else works, at least we have a place to reach out. And so even if there is no real effect or enforcement, at least we have a space or a place to speak up of what is happening internally. Because sometimes, especially if we are having dictatorships or things like that, we cannot use the regular spaces to speak up in our own local realities. So I think it's going to be really hard over the next years, but I think we need more than ever to strengthen these mechanisms and the international community, because in the end, that will be just that we have. We have each other, so we need to keep holding it, because in many cases, that's all we have. Not sure if it helps.
Thanks so much.
Any question in the room? Then, if not, we go. Jody.
Tamara, you're the person that should be doing this fight, because you have always had such a positive outlook. Like, we will just keep going and we will show up, and that's amazing. I think Fazla's question was actually one of the ones I was going to ask, is just like, what is going to happen next, and how do we influence things at the local level, kind of bypassing the national situation. But maybe I'll just switch to my other question about And there are countries where you have seen really good education practices in the judicial system that is actually reflecting on the ground things on, is there, like, is Brazil no, but Canada maybe, are there any places where it's implemented and you're seeing it work?
No.
Oh, that's horrible.
No, I mean, it's just because I think it's more kind of nuance. I mean, I just gave a plain answer, but it's more nuanced than that because because I think, for example, depending on your local reality and the challenges that you have, some trainings might actually help to improve that reality up to a certain point. But the problem or the good thing with human rights and these things is that every step that we move forward becomes the new floor. And we don't want to stay there. We want more. And we want more. And we want more because we want to live better lives, right? So I don't know. So sometimes there are community initiatives in different places that can have a small effect in that community, just overcoming traditional biases. So, for example, one thing that I learned through this global campaign for equality and family law. So, maybe that could be an example of the small building blocks or moving forward. There are some organizations within the campaign that work a lot with Islam and Muslim laws, which I'm not an expert at all, but they have been working in different ways with religious leaders, because in some countries, the law, especially family law, emerged from religion, and you don't have a civil code per se, but you use a lot of the Islam or the Quran regulations. So these women, they have been working with these religious leaders. So there's even a program called Iman for She or something like that, where they try working with them to bring in a more feminist or progressive perspective to the Quran, to help broaden up women's rights in those communities. And in many cases, these women are making alliances with these religious leaders, and little by little, are able to sort of advance, but the interesting thing is that in these cases, the women are sort of behind the scenes making the talk with the leaders, but then the leaders make the change little by little. So this wasn't a case of not necessarily a state law change, but that had positive effects on those particular Muslim communities that they work. So they have an organization, I think they are in California, called Muslim for Progressive Values, that they have a lot of training in this along these lines. So this is one thing, but so it really will depend. And then in some cases you're going to see, well, in that community, feminine genital female genital mutilation was a big thing, and then we started working with the community and changing views and etc., and then we changed that. But then I think it's just when it's hard to make it like the scale thing, like the judiciary as a more like big thing, and that's kind of hard. But I truly think it's worth keep working, because every little step that we move forward, it's a good thing, and I think that this power of feminism, that it's really to name things. When we name things, they become real, they exist, right? So parental alienation, I think that what for me was so interesting about the whole process was because parental alienation was a thing that women were complaining a lot about, but being able to have the experts at the United Nations framing it as gender-based violence, it's very powerful, because then it starts to exist as such, and then, okay, we have people who believe, psychologists or people who believe in parental alienation, even though it's controversial, blah, blah, blah. But then we have a counter voice saying, this is a form of gender-based violence. So yeah, so I think it's worth it. But as we're moving forward, I don't know. It was so funny. I'm just gonna share an anecdote, Jody, just for you, Jody. These days we were listening to the news, and we were just the Trump taxes and tariffs and stuff. And I was trying to explain to my 6-year-old the situation, and she was like, this president of the United States, he's so bossy. What does he mean?
Yeah.
He thinks he can boss around people in the world, tell them to leave, to go, to make more money. I think we should call the police. So, you know, maybe. So maybe this is the most progressive thing that we need to do. You know, we need to form new generations that will kind of think critically about everything, but also about gender stereotypes. Because I often say too, like, maybe I won't see the change that I've been fighting for, but maybe my daughters will see some of it. Because the people who are in the judiciary and are in their 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever, they maybe not undergo the gender training and etc. But maybe the new judges, they will come in with fresh eyes because they have been socialized, they have been exposed to other contents. So maybe I think my answer is like, more than the formal training, I think what we need is work more broadly with the society. And I think this sounds really vague kind of thing, but you know, this really early things that we have in with small kids, and how do we change their perceptions, you know, like for example, how do we work on every day to for more equality? So one day, my other daughter, for example, 5-year-old, she came home and said, "Mom, my friend at school, who's a guy, said I cannot play karate because I'm a girl." And I'm like, well, you go there and tell him that you do karate, you know, and girls can do karate. And then they become a karate conversation at daycare, because whether girls can, you know, do martial arts. And they had a day dedicated to that. So maybe, you know, that was just one little small thing that will, but if we keep offering this sort of possibilities to broke the stereotypes early on, we will have a society that will be more receptive and more attentive to this forms of gender-based violence. Also, because I think the parental alienation shows us that the violence has changed from a very physical kind of violence to a more subtle maybe is not the right word, but you know, we're talking about coercive control, and we're talking about emotional abuse, which is harder to materialize, you know. So yeah, I think we need to start breaking these very early on, you know. So I think, yeah, no hope for me, but maybe for them. That's why I'm here.
Tamara, we have to bring this session to a close soon. Maybe you can briefly still address Mylene Elliman's follow-up, where she said she wanted to clarify she referred to the coercive control in Massachusetts. We have several states now with coercive control laws, but the issue of is implementation, because there are no accountability mechanisms for judicial bias against protected mothers. In states, counties, countries that have legislation banning parental alienation, do you know how they enforce the ban? Like, how has the decision from the Supreme Court of Columbia affected practice? Do you have a comment, Tamara, or?
Yes, very, very briefly, I promise.
Yeah.
Hi, Millie. Thank you for that. I think that's a great question, because I often say, okay, if we repeal parental alienation law tomorrow, it won't solve the problems, because we still have the bias ingrained within the judiciary. So it's really, and also this is another thing in this global campaign that I've been participating. What we see is like, okay, we have countries where, you know, we have this Muslim law that in some states, it's like women cannot have access to inheritance, or unfair divorce laws. In Latin America, we don't have explicitly biased civil law regarding marriage, for example. We don't have that. But the way the laws are enforced are very biased. So that's why we need to keep working on the gender stereotypes and the social bias. And I think no, because the second part of the question, if anything was successful in the recommended bans, I think no, because they are very recent. And so, for example, in Colombia, that was just in 2023. But Colombia is also is a country that has another very complicated human rights situations more broadly. So some things sometimes get lost on the way because they have other. Unfortunately, you know, it's hard to keep track of everything. But for example, in case of Brazil and Canada, or even Sweden, the recommendations came out in late 2024, so like November or October 2024. So we still need to figure out what to do. But one thing we can do for sure, it's you know, stick the government and say, here, we have this. What are we doing about it? How we're going to do that, you know, and start this advocacy at the local level based on the recommendations that we got. I think that's the way forward. Thank you.
Congratulations on your book. Thank you for letting us into your current research agenda. And thank you and congratulations on your activism. You know, I think your presentation gave us a sense of how much energy, discipline, stamina you need to see things through. And yet it's not an easy thing to do. And you have been at it for over 20 years now. And you gave us at least a little bit of hope, you know, in very adverse political times. So thank you for this. It was great seeing you, and we hope to see you back here at some stage.